Please help me welcome Elizabeth Otto.
Thank you. Great, thanks. So is that good? Upsie, hang on. Hi. Are you all hanging in there, or are you Bauhaused out yet? There were 1,253 people at the Bauhaus, so we've got a lot to cover still. No, I'm just kidding. I won't. I won't go through all of them, and I couldn't actually. So, great to be here, and my role today is to kind of complicate traditional narratives of the Bauhaus. Fortunately, I think for all of us, what you've heard so far has already been very complex and rich. So I'll be building on that and focusing in part on work that I've been doing in a number of projects. I'll show you covers just so you get a sense of what those are. This is my book that's coming out at the end of the month, so there's a postcard in the gift shop if you want to take one with you if you're interested. It's a little bit more of an academic book, I should say, to be fair. But I'll be speaking from this, and I think this idea of a haunted Bauhaus, which I'll explain to you in more depth, is a way of thinking about how we can consider the projects of the Bauhaus in a richer, more full way through a number of lenses that aren't associated with the school. So I would say that if we look at the history of modern art, there are various diagrams about what leads to what, Cubism, Futurism leads to Cubism, etc. And the Bauhaus is not only, as you've heard, much, much bigger than a movement like Cubism, no matter how broadly you construe it. But it's also just much more complicated and kind of a richer thing. Often these modern art is systematized in terms of rational and irrational modernisms. And the Bauhaus gets characterized as the most rational of all modernisms, to the point that some critics get carried away and say it's the origin of Nazism because it's trying to regiment every aspect of modern life. And if you look, you can find elements of that because, as you've already, I think, started to gather, there are a lot of different things going on there. But what I want to show you are the centrality and the importance of women. I'll be talking about for the most part today, and I'll touch briefly on spirituality, which you've heard a bit about, what I call a queer Bauhaus, and the issue of politics. I'll talk about that briefly at the end, and then tomorrow afternoon I'm doing a breakout session focused just on that if you're interested in more. I just wanted to explain briefly this notion of haunting, why I used haunted Bauhaus. Okay, one reason is because it's fun to say, haunted Bauhaus. But also the idea of haunting is one that even over the past couple of centuries, say 1848 in Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, he says a specter is haunting Europe, and he's talking about communism. So this is a way that a lot of philosophers and theorists have talked about something that is sort of present and absent at the same time. And a theorist I found very useful is a sociologist named Avery Gordon, who wrote a book called Ghostly Matters. And she talks about haunting as the phenomenon where there are maybe in a history figures who are pushed to the side, but they're kind of always there in our peripheral vision. And she calls these the people who show up and just won't leave. So this book is, and my talk today, is a way of showing, these kind of insistent elements that are often cast as marginal to the Bauhaus, but in fact, I think if we put them in the center and really focus on them, we understand something very different about the school, why it matters, and the time out of which it comes, and perhaps also its implications for today. So, actually, I'm just going to advance. No, it's okay. I'll speak about this. This is a work by Mahayana Pant, whose name hopefully is starting to be familiar to you. She's shown up in a couple of slides. She was the one who designed that lamp off to the side that in one of Jeffrey's slides. I'll show it to you again in case you didn't catch it. You might not have been looking for the peripheral lamp. But this object actually holds the record for the highest price ever paid at auction for a Bauhaus object. So I would contend, at least by economics, she might be considered one of the most famous Bauhaus members. And yet, she often fails to appear in a number of histories. And when she does, she's kind of one of the sort of secondary Bauhaus members. This is a tea extract pot, so it's 4 inches wide. There's also only, I believe, 5 in existence. So that's perhaps part of what accounts for its fame, but it also encapsulates Bauhaus principles. It's been called Bauhaus in a nutshell because it brings together this play of pure forms with pure materials. It looks as if it would be, an item of the machine age that could be mass-produced. In fact, it's actually kind of a perfect contradictory Bauhaus object because it's made of very expensive materials and by hand. But it appears kind of all that the Bauhaus is becoming right in this moment of 1924. And the price was I think it was just over $350,000 set in 2007. I think it's possible it'll be superseded at some point soon, but we'll see. So the image on the left shows the Bauhaus masters on the roof of the new Dessau building in December of 1926, right as it was, the building was completed. And we can take it in one way as an index of the institution, right? It's all these men, and on the right there's one woman, Günther Stutzel, the head of the weaving workshop, who's kind of pushed a bit to the side. And often when I talk about Bauhaus history, I'll say, like, it's 5 guys. People think it's 5 guys, but in fact it was 1,253 people. So that's one view of the Bauhaus, but the one I'd like to show you has more to do with this same space photographed a few years later. And this is an image from the Bauhaus women's gymnastics course taught by Carla Grosch, who's flying through the air on your right there. She was on staff as the women's gymnastics teacher. She also participated in the theater and was just kind of an amazing dancer and mover herself. And you can see that the women in this photograph really are quite comfortable owning this space, that this is something that belongs to them. And I think we can make that argument of the Bauhaus itself, although, as I'll also explain to you, it was not without sexism. It was not a completely equal institution. But it was also, as the Germans so nicely put it, a child of its time. So Bauhaus women were, in fact, in all workshops throughout the institution, every single one of them, and all programs, as this graph shows you. So the little black bars are female participants, and the lighter colored ones are male participants. So of the 1,253, this is a breakdown of where people were doing their primary studies. You can see weaving down here. Oops, sorry. There, with the bright light. Weaving, definitely, that's where women were getting a fair amount of pressure to go. But they were also, in many places, including architecture, which is remembered as the most male-dominated field. So women were encroaching or finding their way into most of the workshops. At the same time, as I mentioned, there was some structural sexism. So the first semester of the Bauhaus 1919, spring of 1919, there were slightly more than 50% women who enrolled in the school. And this presented a problem because Gropius, I contend he was not particularly sexist for his time, but he knew his time and he knew the situation, and that if this new school was filled with women, it would be taken less seriously. So quietly and against actually the law at the time, which guaranteed women equal access to public institutions and education to their male counterparts, the masters decided to make it harder for women to get into the school. And this situation of women dominating would never happen again. Their aim was gradually to reduce the number to about a third of women. They did that by the end. It was about a third women. Overall, it was 38% women. One way to look at this is there were higher admissions criteria for the women, and they produced some really amazing artists and designers. So it's not an upside to sexism, but it's a fact that the women had to be even better to get in to the Bauhaus from that point on. I just wanted to point out that a lot of the work I'm doing has been collaborative. So the graph I showed you is from Bauhaus Bodies on the left, a book I co-edited with my collaborator, Patrick Rossler. And we wrote this book, Bauhaus Women, on the right, which is tells the story of 45 Bauhaus women that we think everyone should know. So it's aimed to really kind of give a totally different history of the Bauhaus, a rejoinder, as it were, to all those books that have left the women out. We also curated with some others in Erfurt, which is a city right next door to Weimar, an exhibition of 4 Bauhaus women. So Gertrude Aunt, who I'll be speaking about today, Mahayana Pant, the ceramicist Margarete Heymann, whose very colorful ceramics you can see down here, and the weaver Greta Reichert. And that just closed, but this is the catalog, so the catalog's still available. And one of the good things that's sort of fun about working on these women is there's a lot to uncover and discover. Okay, so as I said, a lot of what I'll focus on today in thinking about this idea of a bigger Bauhaus, right, an architectural metaphor, is talking about women. So the first part of my talk will really be looking at the work of 4 different Bauhaus women, and then I'll talk a bit more briefly about these other elements of how we can expand our notion of the Bauhaus. Okay, this is a work by Philippe Supo, whose name was Anna Niemeyer when she joined the Bauhaus. This is another aspect of working on female artists, is they change their names a lot. So you have to look in the index like in 5 places for some of them. So she was Erna Niemeyer, she was Erna Meta Niemeyer, she was Renata Green when she was a fashion journalist, she was Ray Green, then she was Ray Richter, and finally she was Philippe Supo. So I give her this name because she is best known under it, but you could look for her in many indexes in different ways. So writing in the Werkbund journal Die Form, which was a very prominent design journal of the time, in this article, actually, Philippe Supo wrote, "A dress is not there for its own sake, but to be worn." She said, "Today, 90% of all women work, and these 90% need rational clothing. Life is in perpetual motion. Preference for line, color, and attitude change, and these penchants also differ for each person. It must be a matter of fulfilling the specific demands of a dress's utility. This is the central problem of today's fashion for the 90% of women." So she's right away positioning the issue of clothing and appearance for women as one of practicality and of one of dealing with a situation in change. And I was very glad that Jeffrey talked about the Bauhaus object as really one that you can't recognize because they're about transformation and change, because that's the lens under which I want to talk about these 4 Bauhaus designers. So this was what she called the transformation dress, which was her own design. And basically you would have a simple unit, you can see it on the top left there, which came with a few select elements so that you could transform it for a number of occasions. And the idea was, you know, if you're the modern woman, you're not at home with your closet, you're out doing stuff. So you could go from work, say, and in the evening, right before you leave, clip on this longer skirt on top of the sheath and put a little stole on and a brooch and go straight to a cinema opening or, you know, maybe to the theater. There was a weekender version of this that had kind of sporty shorts. Philippe Supo, when she was designing in Paris, was one of the pioneers of the culottes. And the idea was that you could go from work to get on the train, you'd just have a little tiny purse with you, and you could go hiking because you'd have, you know, all different things to change up your look. This particular dress could be transformed into 10 different outfits. Philippe Supo studied weaving, of course, at the Bauhaus, but she also was a part of the Mazdaznan religion. She was interested in Sanskrit. She rode her bicycle to the nearby university in Jena so that she could take Sanskrit. And she became involved in avant-garde circles in Berlin because many Bauhaus members were going back and forth between the provincial city of Weimar and the exciting metropolis of Berlin. So there she knew Otto Umber was his name, a Bauhaus dropout who had become a famous photographer, and he introduced her to Hans Richter and Viking Egeling, both of whom are remembered as extremely pioneering avant-garde filmmakers. And often her name doesn't appear in books, especially about Richter, even though they were married. So Viking Egeling created, these are just stills from it, but this is a purely abstract film. It was often referred to as absolute film at the time because, we're used to films telling stories, but people at the time were much more interested or as interested in thinking about this as a form of art expression that might be a kind of painting plus, that it would move and do other things besides just tell stories. It might be something more abstract that might kind of expand your mind as much as tell you a story. And so Viking Egeling taught Ray Supo how to make films. She helped him finish his film. He was quite ill at the time. And when he passed away, she took over his film studio. She made films. They don't seem to survive. But she also made pictures out of these films, a number of pioneering kinds of objects. She subsequently then married Hans Richter and worked on his films as well. She knew Fernand Léger, Sergei Eisenstein, a lot of members of the avant-garde of the time, and was a part of these important circles. She moved to Paris, as I've alluded to, and became a fashion journalist, became a fashion designer, had her own house for a while. And in 1933, she met the surrealist poet turned journalist Philippe Supo, and they married. When France fell to fascism, they had already been on the road for a number of years, her taking photographs to illustrate his newspaper articles. And they were in Tunisia with a lot of expats, and she got special permission to go into the reserved quarter, as it was known, which was a neighborhood locked actually from the outside for female outcasts. So it's sometimes remembered as the kind of prostitution quarter, but in fact, these women were all different kinds of outcasts who had no income, sort of barely survived. And it was extremely rare for anyone to be allowed in, and that Ré Supo got permission to go in with a single police escort. He appears in some of her photographs, and photographed for 2 days was completely unprecedented. And this body of photographs shows this deep empathy with these women, much more kind of investigates their very simple lives and often seems to document, as here, a connection with them. In 1942, the Suppos had to board one of the last buses leaving Tunis for Algeria as fascist forces advanced on the city. And they had to leave not only her entire photo archive, but her camera itself behind, because if they'd been caught with a camera, they would have been shot on the spot. So they left. They were in Algeria for a while with absolutely no income, just sort of trying to stay with friends or acquaintances. Eventually they go to North America, where Philippe Supo is working for Charles de Gaulle's exile government, trying to set up kind of new media communications or kind of, relationships with Free French Radio, that kind of thing. And they still have no money, so they can't buy her a camera. But I love this portrait because it shows kind of her not only transforming herself again and again as an artist, but dealing with contingency. So here she's at a county fair kind of thing in Buenos Aires, and she's playing a game where if you shoot a bullseye, your prize is that your picture's automatically taken, and she shot a bullseye. So she's a photographer without a camera, but manages to take this self-portrait under these incredibly bizarre and strange instances nonetheless. In the background is Giselle Freund, another fellow expat photographer who circulated with Bauhaus colleagues, and it sort of gives a sense of how these circles just kind of keep meeting up in places you wouldn't expect. This is the second of the artists I want to present to you, Friedel Dicker, who came to the Bauhaus early on. She was Johannes Itten's student already in Vienna. And she came from a very poor family. She was raised by a single father, and they had absolutely no money. She was one of the first students to receive a scholarship at the Bauhaus, and she was the first student to be asked by the masters to tutor other students because she was so skilled, and also because they knew she could probably use the money. So she was at the Bauhaus for about 3 years and was kind of into everything. She made puppets, she did street performances, she did theater costumes, she also took drawing, she did bookbinding, which was one of the options for women. She did not weave, as far as I know. And when she left, she started with her former romantic partner and longtime business partner, Franz Singer, another Bauhaus Itten student. They started a design studio, first in Berlin, and then they moved back to Vienna, where they were both from. And among the things they created was this kind of transformable toy set for students, a lot like Lego, right? Except Lego's a post-war thing. This is well before that, in 1925, and it was called Fantasias, and the idea was a child could build different pieces together to make whatever he or she felt like. It also came with a booklet, like here, you could make a pelican, as you see on the right, or a turtle on the left, if the child doesn't have ideas. But you could make a train with it. It was all kinds of things. She was also an interior designer and architect. The two of them created early on, while they were still at the Bauhaus, one of the first flat roof designs, which was kind of a signature Bauhaus gesture, or just more generally of new building at the time, as the movement was called. And she's the first woman documented to have designed a flat-roofed building. This is their work in Vienna. They had this tremendously successful studio where they had student commissions from much farther afield, including Prague and other European cities. And this is for a guest house for the Countess Herriot. The idea is that in they designed two significant rooms for this guest house, and they had a kind of daytime look where you could, oops, I keep pressing the wrong one. You could receive guests here or hang out, have a meal. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a wall of cactuses here. They loved cactuses in the 20s. I don't know why. And at night, then, you could retract the stairway off to the side and pull out a bed, complete with bedside tables, where you could leave your book on it and even put that away. So that it was this transforming architecture that responded to the time, responded to modernity, and made use of all the new kind of technologies and innovations that were available, while creating a new imagined vision of modern comfort. Dicker became politicized, and in 1931 she decided to leave their collaboration. This was, you probably all recall that 1929 was the New York stock crash, and this reverberated globally and set off a global financial crisis that hit Germany very late in 1929 and Central Europe, and early 1930. And Friedel Dicker was involved in the Montessori movement and became a communist member, which was unusual at the time because a lot of people might have been left-leaning, but to become a member, actually, you had to pay regular dues, and it was quite an involved thing. So she started making these elaborate programmatic photo montages, and this one really decries the Austrian government, which is, she says, the bourgeoisie in general is becoming fascist. That's one of the things she puts in here, and that the government is giving out all this money for troops and weapons, whereas meanwhile the poor are starving of hunger. As we see in the center, there's a figure of a male worker and his starving child. She became a target of, because she was so politically active, and was arrested for her political activities. and in 1935 had to actually, 1934, she was arrested and was interrogated. It was quite a difficult situation. And it was actually Franz Singer, who was still her friend, who came to get her out. And the story goes that what she was accused of was creating false documents. And since she was an artist who could do anything, she probably did, passports for people to leave, that kind of thing, forging. And so when Franz Singer went in, they said, we hear she's an artist. We hear she's creating these forgeries. And he said, Friedel, she can't draw a straight line. And he got her out. But because she could do anything, she also knew how to photograph. So she photographed all of her political photo montages before she left town and then destroyed them because they would have been a liability to anyone who had them. I'll just say briefly that not unlike, unfortunately, too many Bauhaus members and a good number of women, her story is tragic, but there's a kind of end chapter that I think is very important for thinking about where the Bauhaus goes, right? We hear about Black Mountain College, the new Bauhaus in Chicago, Gropius at Harvard, maybe that it was taught, in Japan and Australia and South America and Argentina. But Friedel Dicker ended up in Theresienstadt, ghetto and concentration camp. And she taught 500 children using the methods that she learned from her teacher, Etienne, also Gertrude Aunt, as a kind of proto-art therapy. So of her students who survived, they said they remember, how positive it was to go in there. And there would just be sort of scraps of paper, things that were foraged. But she would ask them to draw and to think about really positive things. Some of it was just rhythmic exercises. Others were, to draw their dreams, or stars or things that were outside of the camp to kind of get them out of this really dark and troubled space. And I could say more about her. I may talk about her more tomorrow, but she perished in Auschwitz in the fall of 1944. I've spoken about Mahayana Pant. She's the third of the designers I just want to talk about in more depth. Here is in the ceiling here throughout the weaving workshop, you can see the lamps designed by Mahayana Pant in collaboration with her workshop colleague Hans Prisrembel. And these are adjustable, transformable lamps, right? So that they respond actually to the situation of the Bauhaus right as it's moving into Dessau, where they're still doing designing there. They're doing some work. You can see in the workshop they have still these large looms, but they're also designing for industry. So, sometimes they need a lamp for really close work. Sometimes they need more general lighting for working on the looms. I want to turn more to photography, something I touched on with Philippe Supo's work, because for both Plant and the final of the women I'll talk about, Gertrude Aunt, photography is really one of the main things they're working on, and the way they're considering, I think, they're changing identities at the time. I really liked yesterday evening how Barry and Leah pointed out that the machine age of the Bauhaus, or the most important machine, is the camera. So Mahayana Plant was, like many Bauhaus people, already a trained artist when she got to the school in 1923. She passed the preliminary course with Alpers and Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who became her main mentor. In one semester, and Moholy-Nagy, who was himself pretty new to the Bauhaus, said, hey, why don't you go into the metal workshop? I guess he hadn't got the message that all the women were supposed to go into weaving, right? And she later said, I did not want to weave. I would have been interested in furniture design, but I didn't have much upper body strength, so I thought, why not? And she also later recounted that that the early days in the metal workshop were astoundingly boring. I mean, astoundingly, that she just had to do the most repetitive, dreary grunt work over and over again. And only after she persevered and did this for quite a bit did her male colleagues admit to her they just were trying to get her to leave. And they made it much worse for her. They were kind of bullying her. She stayed around, stuck it out, and then creates things within that first year, like the tiny tea extract pot. She eventually became, in 1927, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's assistant, which was an official and paid position. And when he left in 1928, she became the acting head of the metal workshop. And it's at this time she turns to photography, something she already knew how to do, to create this series of self-portraits. And they're all reflected in, actually, I don't know if you can decipher the image, but basically that is a tiny string hanging what you could imagine as a large, but not that large, Christmas ornament kind of a thing. It's a reflective surface it's a metallic surface on a glass ball. And you have to remember, she's become a metal designer, right? So this is her using a machine to reflect herself back to you through the medium that she identifies with. So it's a way of making herself kind of this hybrid, kind of cyborg kind of a figure. At the same time, she's made herself diminutive and cute, right? She's off to the side. She's this kind of imp there. And she's leaving composition a little bit to chance because she worked with a Rolleiflex, which has its viewfinder on the top. So she had to kind of set this all up and basically look in the ball and then kind of find where the lens was to look back in it. So there's a lot going on in these images in terms of how she's defining herself and this kind of push-pull between asserting herself as this new kind of designer and a new kind of person and also kind of feminizing herself. And I'll say just a brief bit about that. In some of these, it kind of is topsy-turvy, right? Like things we know that are very small, like the grain of this Bauhaus fabric, which is so gorgeous, that she has there, is shown to be very large, whereas her head is shown to be small, and the camera itself, which kind of lurks in the background. In one of these, she actually poses in a relatively traditional form, right? If you think of various Venuses in art history, where they kind of pose like this, and she's in a fancy dress, all in white. She's in her Bauhaus studio for this, as she is in all of these. So this is a close-up just from this. And the more I looked at this, I was like, what is she reading? Well, it's the Bauhaus in-house journal. So she's kind of presenting herself as this kind of, Bauhaus babe, playing with this idea at the time. But interestingly, this very journal that she's photographed herself with has her own one published essay in it. And what she says in that essay, she's been accused by the constructivist Noam Gabo, who had visited the Bauhaus, of leading the workshop to create what he called a style. And as you've learned, Bauhaus style was not good, right? Because the idea was, what he was saying is, you're just making things that look Bauhaus rather than being truly constructivist, which is what the school is kind of inspired by at this time, which is being true to your materials, being true to the function of the objects. And she says, no, in this essay, we are not creating a Bauhaus style. We are working scientifically. If we're making a teapot, it had better not drip. And, she says, we didn't invent the light bulb, but we are carrying out scientific studies in order to really create the right settings in these lamps that they were designing for for the electric light bulb. So I showed you the overhead light before, but in fact, under her work as the assistant and the acting director, the metal workshop starts to approach profitability, which, next to wallpaper, they did really quite well, not as well as wallpaper, but they did bring in money. She secured contracts with the lighting firm, the lighting line, Candom, in Leipzig for mass production of things like desk lamps and bedside table lights that we think of as normal. But this is a time when electrification is actually coming into homes in really large numbers for the first time, so they need lamps. And so she's here, showing her own savvy as a Bauhaus designer by including this element, even as she presents herself much more in a traditional kind of how women are shown in art history sort of pose. Okay, you know what, I want to just say one more thing. She does this at a moment, 1929, when there's a theorist who I find very interesting to read. Her name is Joan Riviera. She was a psychoanalyst working in London. I don't think the two women knew of each other's work even at all, certainly not at that time. But right at 1929, Joan Riviera writes about her fellow professional women, how some of them in certain situations are tremendously accomplished and are giving, she uses the example of scientific papers to their male-dominated, psychology or whatever, major forums where they're speaking. And she talks about situations where they suddenly make themselves very feminine, hyper-feminine, and almost girlish. And what she talks about is femininity as being a kind of masquerade that women may put on or take off at certain times in order to avoid having the men get mad at them for taking on power. And I think that's interesting to think about this particular photograph, where just as she's, becoming among the leaders of the Bauhaus, she's directing one of the major workshops. It's completely dominated by men. She's dealing with constantly being undermined, even by her male friends and collaborators in there who are saying, like, are you sure you're up to the task? She creates this series of photographs of herself where she's both, asserting herself as a designer and a really competent photographer, among many other things. And she's also showing herself as hyperfeminine. The last of the women I want to talk about is Gertrude Aunt, who trained as an architect before she even got to the Bauhaus and went there specifically to become an architect, and she became a weaver. So she is one of those who really does stick to that story. She became their expert in rug design, and this is an example of her work on the floor of the director's office. Because she was so good at rug design, she was also considered an expert colorist. And in 1927, she sat for her journeyman's exam, right, because the guild system was still in place. This was something that a lot of Bauhaus members availed themselves of because it gave them official qualifications for working afterwards. And she passed that exam to become a journeyman weaver, and she said to herself that she would never weave again in her life, and she never did. So what did she do? Well, she went off and married her fellow Bauhaus student, Alfred Aunt, and interestingly, he was an architect. We heard already yesterday that some of the most prolific architects of the 20th century and designers often were two people. I think she was probably helping him quietly in the office. But she also then returned with him to the Bauhaus as not a student or a Bauhaus member, but as a master's wife. Because her fellow student had become a master. So she was living in one of the master's houses in Dessau, on the Dessau campus, so separate from that Gropius-designed large building, but also in a building designed by him. And out of what she called pure boredom, she started taking photographs of herself. She'd already learned to photograph so that she could do that for the architectural practice she worked in before coming to the Bauhaus. And she called herself at the time a do-nothing. And it seemed like she just kind of started making these photographs. They often involve fabric that seems to cover her, but also in a way almost kind of suffocate her or smother her to a certain extent. She here, I think, seems kind of comically shocked, right, at the dots in front of her face on this veil. Sometimes they have elements of slapstick. Some of them look almost somewhat historical, like this one, which is the cover of my book, where, there are elements of the Victorian, there's elements perhaps of mourning, elements of the emerging new woman, of the flapper of the 20s, but it's all kind of a mishmash that isn't really going anywhere. And these, I think, are very important, not as a masquerade, in fact, because she's not really masquerading as anything, but I see them as really her creating an art of refusal. So the the Bauhaus, as we've been hearing, is all about productivity. It's all about, having your mind switched on so that you can anticipate what your society needs before it even knows it needs it, right? And she was someone who was able to do that. And yet, in the context of weaving, where she just wasn't feeling like that was what her calling was, instead, she refuses to create and refuses to make anything useful. And I think these photographs illustrate a kind of play in that and embracing what we might call an art of failure. I'll just say very briefly the few other elements that my book touches on. And this photograph I actually first saw I think I first saw it in Barry Bergdahl and Leah Dickerman's Bauhaus catalog from 10 years ago, which, if you don't know it, is a classic at this point. So, I was very curious about why, even if we know about Mazdaznan and some of the religions that Bauhaus members were practicing, why would a Marcel Breuer chair be shown, as a kind of spirit photograph, which was a very strong tradition in the Bauhaus, in photography throughout the later 19th and early 20th centuries. But it's exactly not what we think of with the rational Bauhaus. And in fact, this science, as people who were interested in spiritualism at the time, which was a kind of religion and practice and belief throughout the United States and much of Europe and elsewhere in the world, it was still taken very seriously, so much so that even in 1927, a seance was held in the Sorbonne University for scientific investigation. So in my first chapter, I explore what the various kind of utopian plans were of the Bauhaus. This is a settlement that in the center has that crystal symbol of faith that Gropius talked about. It was put together by students. It also has a house of gymnastics in it because bodily exercise was so important to them. Nudist gymnastics were something that also visited the Bauhaus during this early period. And Itten was, of course, as you've already heard, tremendously influential through Mazdaznan and his general interest in spirituality and the body. But equally as important was the work of Gertrude Aunt, who was as influential as Itten was during those early years, and yet was taken out of history to a large extent. In fact, if you look at the 1923 Bauhaus exhibition catalog, which was then reproduced, elements of it were reproduced in the Gropius's 1938 and other Gropius and Bayer and Isa Gropius's MoMA exhibition. You have in this catalog first an essay by Gropius and the second essay is by Gertrude Aunt. And what she describes is what she taught, which was called harmonization studies. She was a composer, and she came up with this theory that basically used synesthesia, which is a sort of a crossing of the senses, as a theory for thinking about how you more or less harmonize or align your body. So the idea is that musical notes, colors, and places in the body and bodily poses all have certain harmonies, and that if you're in alignment, you will feel them. Okay, just so that we have a minute to converse at the end, I just want to show you a few more kind of tantalizing images. I contend that spirituality at the Bauhaus didn't go away, even when it became much more obviously technological. I talk about what I call a queer Bauhaus, which is images like this where we don't know the sexual identity of the Bauhaus members, but they often show kind of desires that at this time, when male homosexuality is still criminalized by the German government, those desires are being imaged and yet shown to be constrained at the same time. Other Bauhaus members created images that really cite from the very lively underground gay culture of Weimar, Berlin, or kind of explore, as the famous photographer Florence Henry did, the self. Henry was a lesbian. She shows herself, her lesbian partner, and she also, when she ran out of money, created some softcore porn that sold well. And lastly, I'll just say the least about this and then wrap up and we can talk more, because I'll talk about this in a breakout session tomorrow if any of you are interested. But the Bauhaus really was a political place, and that's something that often gets written out. So this is a communist agitational cart, giving information and basically saying, you can recognize, it's a series of images, right? Swastika leads to war, leads to death, etc. And they say on it, workers, these guys want you to be the next cannon fodder. Don't stand for it. March with us in the communist parade, basically, or demonstration on this date. And so I was interested to explore what Bauhaus political work really looks like. And, they had an active communist cell. They actually had a communist-sponsored journal that was more or less a zine, but they had it. They created propaganda. This is the female worker. And they created new kinds of images. And one of the things I'll be showing you tomorrow is actually an actual Bauhaus film made by one of the Bauhaus members. It's 55 seconds long, so you'll get to see the whole thing. And the last thing I'd like to say, though, is that I'd like to comment briefly on this issue of the Bauhaus and Nazism, especially in relation to Bayer, because I know that this has come into the press recently locally. And when I first found out about Bayer's work, especially this image, for the Nazi government, I judged him, right? I mean, I looked back and thought, how could you do that? And the more I learned, the more I understood really how complicated the system was, or the situation was, which is not to either excuse or condone what he did, but I think to better understand it is very important. He was Austrian. He saw himself as apolitical, and he needed work. And he was a listed degenerate artist, so he was in some danger. He was also married to a Jewish woman, and their child was considered half Jewish. And I think also we have the benefit of hindsight. We know what the Nazis go on to do from this point on, and we're already doing to political prisoners at this point. Bayer saw himself as uninvolved and as interested in getting out and could not get a visa. So while I think there's a lot we could still say about this, I just wanted to sort of say that there were Bauhaus members who continued to work and were employed for a regime that is absolutely abhorrent. But there were also Bauhaus members who worked directly for the Nazis, including, these are the gates of Buchenwald that were done by Franz Ehrlich, who was a prisoner himself for his politics, and then stayed on to work for the camp. And so he's using a Bauhaus font here to create something that says to each his own. And one Bauhaus member, Fritz Ertel, was, a documented hardcore Nazi. So kind of runs the gamut. I think trying to tell a bigger history of the Bauhaus gives us an idea of where these ideas could go, and a range of contradictory, but I think much more perhaps interesting than some of the older stories we've had of the Bauhaus as simply rational and modern and giving us all nice products tends to give us. So thank you, and we've got a couple minutes for questions if you'd like. Any questions? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. They say there's a mic we should get to you.
I was interested in what you said about feminism being used as a defense.
Femininity, yeah.
I'm sorry, not feminism. Femininity, excuse me, being used as a defense. And I just wanted to know what's the name again of this psychoanalyst?
Yeah. You can actually, if you Google it, it's available online. Her name is Joan Riviera, with an E at the end, and it's called Femininity as a Masquerade.
Thanks.
And it's, yeah. Other questions? People might be Bauhaused out.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why would a woman keep changing her name as an artist? You would think you would want to be known by your name.
Right. So she didn't change her artist name, but when women married, they lost their citizenship. I mean, Mahayana Pant was a Norwegian citizen the entire time because she was married to a Norwegian guy. And then there was the artist's name thing. So it was actually a Dadaist who, I'm blanking on his name, Hanover. Come on, art historians. Huh? Schwitters, yeah. Kurt Schwitters named her Ray. So that became her first name. And then she had a journalist name, and then she married one guy. So, yeah. So I think it also, though, highlights a good point, which is I think most of these people weren't seeking to become famous. Those were just their names, and this was their work. You know, they weren't interested in building a name for themselves necessarily, the way we tend to think of it. Great question. I'm also around for the next days, so you don't have to ask a question now if you just want to ask me something informally or chat about something. I can talk about it more. Last call? All right, I think we're all set, and I'll see you at lunch. Thank you.